S.S.S. Terumah, Tafshin Pei Beis, and this week we begin a whole new part of the Torah. The Torah for the next, I believe it's like 5 weeks, Terumah, Tetzaveh, Kisisa Vayakel, Pekudei, and this year there's no Parshas together, so for 5 weeks we're going to be speaking in detail about this entity known as the Mishkan, the place of Hashras Hashchina on this world, the Mishkan, where Hashem says that He wants a place, a dwelling place in this world. And over the years, we've spoken about the Mishkan and what it does for Klal Yisrael and what it really means to each and every individual person, what the Mishkan represents, how we have to follow the lessons of the Mishkan, the different ways and different kalim that were in the Mishkan, from the menorah representing the Torah, from the shulchan representing a person's parnasa, a little how to do things in Gashmias, Mizbeach HaKetoires. Each one of the kalim in the Mishkan teaches us and tells us different ways how to act and what Hashem would like to see from us. But this year I'd like to focus in on something that we really haven't spoken about. And this is something that took place in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, something that was in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and that was the Kruvim. Now the Kruvim were a very, very interesting thing. And let me first read you the Pasuk that speaks about it. The Pasuk says that you had the Oroin, and on top of the Oroin, V'dibarti itcha me'ala kapoires mibein shnei hakruvim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying that you know where I'm going to speak to you from when you go into the Holy of Holies, and there's an Oroin and there's Kruvim. From between those two Kruvim, that is where I am going to speak to you from. That's the place. And then the Torah tells us something very interesting. V'hayu hakruvim parsei knofayim lamala. The Kruvim they spread their wings upward, soichachim b'chanfeihem ala kapoires, where they sort of covered and leaned over the kapoires, pneihem ish el achiv. That the Kruvim, and we all picture the Kruvim in our minds. The truth is, today you have these svarim, you could pull out your trusty art scroll diagrams of the Mishkan. I like to pull it out every year for these few weeks, at least when we learn the Parshios, to get some sort of accurate picture of what it looks like. But now, the way we described it from the Pasuk, you could see the Keruvim, their wings were spread, and the Torah says that they faced each other. And from between those two Keruvim, that is from there the word of Hashem would go forth and speak to the Bnei Yisrael. So obviously, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking through the Kruvim, right there, from between the Kruvim, the Kedusha of the Kruvim must have been a very, very extremely elevated Kedusha, a very elevated holiness. If we pick that place, which the entire Mishkan was focused in, Kodesh Kadoshim, the Aroin, and the Kruvim, from that place, it was a very, very holy place, and the Dvar Hashem came from there. And it seems that just as each of the Kalim of the Mishkan had its purpose, the purpose of the Kruvim was just that, to put forth, and where from there would come forth the Dvar Hashem. And the Nesivos Shalom points out that really the Dvar Hashem, if you think about it, Dvar Hashem should have come out from the Oroin. You had the Luchos, right? The Dvar Hashem should have come out from the Oroin. Yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose that it should come out, for some reason, it should come out from between the Kruvim, because the Kruvim seem to be even more holy than if it would have come out from the Aron. And we're going to speak about that. We find another Chazal. Chazal tell us in other places how very special the Keruvim were. And the Gemara, Maseches Baba Basra, Daf Tzadik Tes Amar Aleph, says that Bizman She Yisrael Oisin Ritzoynei Shel Mokoim, when Klal Yisrael was doing the Ratzoin Hashem, Hoyu HaKeruvim Urin Zeh Bazeh, the Keruvim would be like embracing each other. Uvizman She'ein Oisin Ritzoynei Shel Mokoim, at a time Chas v'Shalom, where Klal Yisrael was not doing the Ratzon Hashem, then Pneihem Laboyis, they would face away from each other. Now, if you think about it, that was a hanhaga of the Beis HaMikdash, which was Lamaila Miderach HaTeva, because everyone saw that an inanimate object, right, something that was made and formed out of gold, it took on a life, and it reacted to the behavior of Klal Yisrael, which is a pella, something unbelievable. Obviously, Lamaila Miderach HaTeva. And the Gemara, Masechta Yuma, Daf Nun Daled Amar Aleph, tells us too that when Klal Yisrael would be Oila Regel, they would open up the Paroiches and they would see the Keruvim embracing each other. And it would be like saying to Klal Yisrael, Re'u chibaschem lifnei hamokoim. Look at the love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for Klal Yisrael, and the fact that the Keruvim were embracing each other, that Klal Yisrael was doing Ritzoynei Shel Mokoim, Klal Yisrael was doing the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem was showing from the fact that the Keruvim, showing everyone that the Keruvim were embracing each other, showing the great love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for each and every one of us. So the question is, why Dafka was this message relayed through the Keruvim? Like we said, maybe it should have come, the Dvar Hashem should have come from the Oroim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have picked many other ways to show his love for Klal Yisrael, other ways to show whether we were doing Ritzonei Shel Mokoim or Chas v'Shalom, vice versa. Why Dafka from between the Keruvim? You ever think about that? It's a good question. The Zohar tells us that there are three things that are tied together with an eternal bond. Three things that are tied together. And those three things which are eternally bound together are Kudsha Barichu, Oiraisa v'Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Torah, and Klal Yisrael are tied together. They're bound together, an inseparable bond, an eternally inseparable. That they'll never be separated from each other. And as we see, and as we just spoke about a little bit, the place that all came together, Kudsha Barichu, Oiraisa v'Yisrael, as the Zohar mentions, they all came together at the Keruvim. The Keruvim, we know, the two Keruvim represented Hashem and Klal Yisrael. And they were connected by the Aroino Edus, which was the Torah. The Torah was between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael, so to speak. And that also tells us what that represents is that if a Yid wants to know how to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the only real way to connect to Hashem, you see, one of the Keruvim was Klal Yisrael, one of the Keruvim was HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Aron is what connected it. The Torah is what's connecting it. The only real way to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And people, Avada, there's mitzvahs, there's chesed, there's so many things you could do that bring you closer. But the only real way to absolutely connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with the Torah. And that essentially was the purpose of the Asuli Mikdash, the Shochanti B'Saycham, to connect through the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Klal Yisrael, to connect all three of those things. And that took place, Dafka, that took place between the Keruvim. And that was the great Kedusha of the Keruvim. It demonstrated the great bond of Hashem, Klal Yisrael, and the Torah. And the Dvar Hashem came from there, Dafka. So when Klal Yisrael was doing the Ratzon Hashem, the embracing Keruvim represented that tight bond between Hashem and Klal Yisrael. And the Keruvim, we know too, they represented Midas Ahava, the way they embraced each other, and they represent the three Ahavos, the three great loves that are important for Avodas Hashem. There's Avas Hashem, Avas HaTorah, and Avas Yisrael. Something every Yid has to have. Every Yid has to love Hashem, every Yid has to love the Torah, and every Yid has to love every other Jew. And they all come together at the Keruvim. Now we see what was so special and why Dafka, the Dvar Hashem, had to come out through and from the Keruvim, because that is what connected the three pillars, the three important bonds, the three things of this world: the Kadosh Baruch Hu, Klal Yisrael, and the Torah. And the Nesivos Shalom tells us how and why really the Torah is the great connector between Hashem and Klal Yisrael. If you think about it, how would it be possible for a human being to connect to Hashem? Hashem is called like an Eish Oichla, a fire that consumes. Where do we have a shaykhis to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How could a person who is so physical connect to something that is so spiritual as HaKadosh Baruch Hu? It would just totally consume us. So the Torah, what the Torah does is that when we learn Torah and we follow the Torah purifies us, and it purifies us, it purifies our midos, and it changes us from being physical. It changes us from being full of gashmias, and it changes us to ruchnias. And the more Torah we learn, and the more Torah we keep, and the more we make Torah a part of our lives, the more we're able to connect to Hashem, because the more we are turning into ruchnias. We're turning into what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is more made of, Kaviyachol. And the closer we are to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the closer we get through the Torah, the more we're able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara tells us, Masechta Kedushin, Daf Lamed Amud Beis, famous Gemara, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Barasi Yetzer Hara, I created the Yetzer Hara. We all know that from the day a person is born, he has the Yetzer Hara, and then Barasi Torah Tavlim. I created Torah as the antidote to the Yetzer Hara. You want to fight the Yetzer Hara? There's really only one way, and that's the Torah. And that's what we're saying now, that the Torah turns a person more ruchnias. The Torah is what we need to know at times when we struggle with the Yetzer Hara. We need to know that the Torah is what is there to save us and connect us to Hashem. And that message is projected and presented to us in this week's Parsha when we talk about, it's demonstrated by the Keruvim. How it all came together by the Keruvim, representing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Klal Yisrael, and the Torah being the great connector. Therefore, you see how chashuv that bond is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That Hashem said that the Dvar Hashem is going to come dafka through the Keruvim, dafka through what represents the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to see the world, of a Yid learning Torah, of a Yid living by the Torah, of a Yid following the laws of the Torah. And when we do that, and when we follow those things, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu says the Keruvim will embrace each other. The Keruvim will show HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love for Klal Yisrael. And that is the lesson we need to learn this week when we read and we learn about the Keruvim.